It's a pleasure for me to introduce the moderator for this panel. I will not go into any lengthy introduction because I'm sure everyone is aware of him and his writings, but on behalf of the Society, I'd like to welcome Charles Krauthammer, Senior Editor of New Republic.
Is this mic working? Yeah, it's working. Welcome to this panel. Pleased to be here among you. And I'd like to begin by introducing our distinguished panel. On my left is Irving Kristol, who is a professor of social thought at the NYU Graduate School of Business Administration and the publisher of National Interest and the co-editor of the Public Interest. On my right is Professor Gordon Tullock, Carl Eller Professor of Economics and Political Science at the College of Business and Public Administration of the University of Arizona. And on my extreme right is Godfrey Hodgson, a formerly Washington correspondent for The Observer, also an editor of the London Sunday Times, who is the author of several works on American history and American politics. I have been asked by the powers that be here to act as a fourth panelist in the absence of one of the others whom we had expected, and I've been asked to make some remarks. So I will begin by making a brief introduction and by trying to make three short points on our topic, which is the virtues and the vices of democracy and the conduct of foreign affairs. I'd like to begin by starting with what I think is almost an axiom, which is that in the kind of struggle that we have been in for the last 2 generations with the Soviet Union, a long and protracted twilight struggle, it seems to me fairly obvious that the structures of democracy are in many ways an impediment, and that the command economy and command society that is at the disposal of the Soviet leadership has been an advantage in pressing its cause in this geopolitical struggle. It seems to me that we don't have to do an extensive analysis of that. We can look at the results. It would seem to me a rather startling fact, which historians will note a century or two hence, which is that in the last half of this century, a fairly backward and almost totally isolated power, namely the Soviet Union, attended by rather weak and dependent allies, has been able to stand up against the grandest alliance of great powers probably in the history of the world, meaning the United States, Britain, France, 2/3 of Germany, Italy, you can throw in Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands if you're nostalgic for old empires, Japan, and now a silent partner in China. I think that's an astonishing achievement for the Soviet Union. And not only has it produced this standoff, but it has, in the meantime, become a superpower, consolidated its gains in Europe, acquired a blue water navy and colonies on every continent on Earth, including the Americas now, and in the Central Front has acquired such a superiority of force that the Western alliance has been forced into a reliance on nuclear weapons. Now, my conclusion from that is not Spenglerian. It's not that that democracies are doomed to perish. I'm not quite as discouraged by what some have pointed out as this sort of fatal weakness of democracies, which is the almost automatic preference in peacetime of the electorate for butter over guns. To be sure, it seems to me that democracies have national security policies which might be characterized as generating just enough defense to get by, and get by they have. Now, this isn't always so, because Britain and France in the 30s did not generate enough defense to get by, certainly not France, and Britain was only saved by the United States ultimately. But since the Second World War, it has to be recognized that beyond the line of advance of the Red Armies at the end of the war, not a single inch of European territory has been lost, and that all of those nations behind that line, in other words, on the western side of that line, have flourished. Now, my second point is that in the case of the United States, there is a more serious problem than the generic problems of democracy and the conduct of foreign affairs, and that stems from the unique system of American polity, namely the separation of powers. I won't go into that a lot because that's obviously been the subject of our discussion over the last day and a half. But I would argue that our separation of powers has now reached the point of diffusion and almost evaporation of power. I would point to only one relevant fact, which is that uniquely, almost uniquely among the Western democracies, the American government is incapable of passing a budget. And it seems to me that a country that cannot, whose government is not able to pass a budget, is one that's going to have a very hard time in carrying through a coherent and consistent foreign policy. The causes of this are obvious: the separation of powers, the bicameral legislature. But I think there are several new causes introduced in the last 20 years, namely the decline of the political parties, the overthrow of the seniority system in the Congress, and the rise of the adversary media. The result is that in a place like Britain, if you want to stop the Trident missile program, you have to defeat and replace Mrs. Thatcher. In the US, if you want to emasculate the MX, restrict SDI, or extend SALT II, you can do it all in opposition, and you can do it even by controlling, say, the relevant congressional committee. Many people, from Theodore Draper to Bill Moyers, have interpreted the Iran-Contra affair as the return of the imperial presidency, calling it government by junta. It seems to me that the lesson is exactly the opposite. Here's the most popular and powerful president of our generation, trying to advance his single most cherished foreign policy cause, supporting the Nicaraguan resistance. And he had to resort to a fly-by-night, two-bit operation, running supplies in planes held together by Scotch tape and glue. Now, if that's an imperial presidency, I think it's time for us to return to a Republican presidency. One last point, which is that a lot can be made of the structure of democracy in inhibiting our ability to conduct a coherent foreign policy. But I think that the American problem goes beyond structure, and it has to do with the national ethos. That's often said to be a problem of national will, and referred to, I think, in hyperbole as a loss of national nerve. I think that's a misreading of the American situation. I think American history shows that lack of nerve has not been our problem. The American polity and population is easily aroused in the face of a threat. I think the real problem is the unwillingness and lack of reason that Americans see to be aroused. And that has to do with American history and geography. After all, we are a nation protected by two vast oceans, bordered by two small, weak, and friendly nations who have not been attacked physically by invaders on our mainland since 1812. So that would lead one to what I would call a Native American isolationism, a sense that our physical safety is rather assured. We have 10,000 nuclear warheads. Beyond a Coast Guard, it's hard to see what we need to secure our physical safety. It seems to me the reason that the American national ethos is one of inattention, if you like, or unwillingness to be involved in places around the world to protect our interests and our allies. In many situations, I would point to our hesitation in the Gulf and our ambivalence about Central America as two examples. Has to do not so much with the structure of our democracy, but with this national ethos, which comes out of our history and our geography. As a counterexample, there is a democracy, namely France, that also has a system of government not terribly dissimilar from ours, a democracy with some separation of powers, though hardly as developed as ours. And it has no trouble in deploying 1,500 troops in Chad. And that caused much less opposition than the emplacement of 27 American advisors in El Salvador. So to conclude, I would say that while the structure of our democracy makes it infinitely more difficult to conduct a coherent and forceful foreign policy, I think the root problem is philosophical, and it's a question of national ethos. Our democracy is working rather well in transmitting the ambivalence and uncertainty of the American people about their new and unwanted role in the world as a superpower. The result, faithfully reflected in our foreign affairs, is ambivalence and uncertainty. In this respect, I think you would have to argue that our democracy works. So as a point of prescription, I would say that while it's important to focus on the structural changes that need to be made in order to ensure that small minorities in Congress or elsewhere are not able to stymie and paralyze our foreign affairs, I think the larger issue and the larger challenge is changing that national ethos to accept our new, if unwanted, position in the world. Thank you. Professor Gordon Tullock of the University of Arizona. Professor Tullock.
Thank you. I regret to say, well, first, the good news, I'm going to speak very briefly because we're behind schedule this afternoon. But the bad news is I'm going to be even more discouraging than the previous professor. I was asked to talk about what public choice has to say about it, and I regret to say that public choice pretty unambiguously says that democracies run foreign policy badly. Let me begin by one of the oldest discoveries in public choice, which is that a voter who thinks about the matter very much will be badly informed. This was first introduced by Anthony Downs in an economic analysis of democracy. I expanded the idea and also invented the term rational ignorance in my Toward a Mathematics of Politics. I'm not going to go through the mathematics here, but I recommend my book because I use high school algebra and he uses calculus. Same proof. The second problem that we have encountered is that in general, the basic motive of most elected people, whether it's a president or congressman, is that they want to be reelected. If I may quote a famous aphorism, in order to be a great senator, it is first of all necessary to be a senator. And nobody in either the legislature or, for that matter, in the White House ever forgets that. Now, of course, in the second term, since the 22nd Amendment, presidents may be aware of the fact they're not going to be around much longer, but they usually think that one way or another they'll retain influence if their party stays in. And so you have the actual decisions made by people who are attempting to please a large collection of people who themselves are very badly informed. And this does not work out well, and it works out particularly badly in the case of foreign affairs. Some domestic areas, it works out very well indeed because people with specialized knowledge about one particular area are the only people who are interested in it. Sometimes that doesn't work out very well either. If you look at what we actually observe, or at least what I observe, is that people do have frequently quite strong feelings about political matters, international matters, but usually not very well informed. A friend of mine who happened to be Greek was in London when there was a large street demonstration connected with Greek politics. You know, that people demonstrate about all sorts of things, and he saw it as a research opportunity. And so he went out he and several assistants went out among the demonstrators and just asked them questions about Greece, like, where is Athens? And it turned out, by the way, most of them could tell you where Athens was, but nobody could tell him where Salonika was. And in general, it turned out that these people who were out demonstrating didn't know much about what they were demonstrating for. It was a sort of entertainment activity. Well, what you observed in these cases mainly is a tendency to try to apply ethical assumptions, frequently without realizing that other people have different ethics. Now, we have, as it happens in the United world today, another country which is very ethical. In fact, the current ruler is a former professor of law and, in fact, a professor of moral law, and which is making a vigorous effort to expand its moral principles throughout the world. And Iran is not popular. The United States, the same thing. When I was in the diplomatic service, it was always true. Wherever I went, I happened to go only in places where there were friendly governments in power. The government regarded the United States as a major ally internationally and is one of their major problems domestically, because they realized that we didn't like the way they were running the government domestically, and this led to continuing tension. And I suspect it's one of the reasons why the United States is actually among the more unpopular countries in the world, because of the fact that we are always trying to inflict our moral principles on other people. Now, in a way, this worked well right after World War II, and it's now working badly. But the basic thing that has changed has been that there is no longer any agreement in the United States as to what good morals provides. The people on both sides in Nicaragua are attempting to impose our moral system, except that they disagree as to what that moral system is. The same was true in Vietnam. There was a bona fide difference of opinion as to what was a morally correct decision. None of them became well informed about the matter. You just had, because there's no reason why you should, I assure you the mathematical proof, and by the way, the empirical evidence is overwhelming, confirming the mathematical proof. No one made any serious effort to get ahead, and the politicians, after all, if they don't do on the whole, they have a certain amount of freedom. They can do some things that they just want to do. But if they don't do on the whole what the voters want, they won't be with us much longer. And they know that. So the consequence is a system which on the whole doesn't do very well foreign policy. And if you look at the American history, you'll observe that. We were told about the Tripolitanian War several times. Nobody mentioned the fact that we lost it. We ended up paying ransom. Millions for defense, but nothing, not a cent for tribute. We ended up paying tribute. We lost the War of 1812. We won the Indian Wars because we outnumbered them. We won Mexico because it was such a small country. We beat the Spaniards. And in World War II and World War I, World War II, we had immense numerical superiority, but we lost Korea, that was a compromise ending in a way, and Vietnam. And I think the explanation for this is simply bad management. We are immensely more powerful than our opponents, but the effort to apply a sort of muddled effort to apply moral principles led to a very unfortunate outcome. In the case of Vietnam, I gather the aftermath was the death of about 3 million people. I'm not sure. No one knows exactly how many were killed, but certainly a lot. This is, as I say, depressing, and I regret to say I haven't any solution. The alternative form of government, despotism, of which I've recently written a book, undoubtedly does better in carrying out its foreign policy than we do. But on the other hand, the objectives of its foreign policy are rarely anything that we would regard as desirable. So it is more efficient in carrying out policies with no great reason for them, and we are relatively inefficient. I have no cures for it. When it comes to domestic problems of domestic democracy, I've devoted most of my career to trying to work out ways of improving the internal structure of government and getting it to work better. But when it comes to international affairs, it's very, very difficult indeed to think of anything, and I certainly haven't succeeded.
Thank you, Professor Tullock. I'd like to call upon Mr. Godfrey Hodgson, please.
I thought Mr. Krauthammer's example about the French and Libya was an extremely interesting one. In every system, I think, in every democracy, there is a tension between the people who see the international scene essentially subjectively in terms of their own emotions, their own wishes, and their own interests, and those who, knowing more of the world, because they're called upon to execute foreign policy, have to confront the constraints of reality. But I think that in the United States it is essentially because of the separation of powers that there is an additional dimension to this tension. There has always been what I might call a tug of war. You could almost call it pull devil, pull baker, between the executive and the legislature. But from 1900 until the 1960s, it was generally conceded that it was the function of the executive to take the initiative in foreign policy and in national security policy, subject only to the constraints, rather literally interpreted, of the Constitution. It was in the late 1960s, it was in the context, I think, both of a generalized concern about an overmighty presidency and of the specific concerns about the Vietnam War and Southeast Asia generally, that there was a sort of assault, an intellectual assault on that notion of the primacy of the executive. It was rather like, you remember Dunning's resolution in the 18th century House of Commons, which said that the power of the Crown has increased, is increasing, and ought to be diminished. The Congress started to say the power of the President has increased, is increasing, and ought to be diminished. Now, since 1981, I think the executive has fought back. The question is whether the Iran-Contra affair represents another stopping point against which the pendulum will butt and swing back again, or whether it's going to turn out to represent only a brief interruption in that movement. But I think it's important to understand that it's not now only a tug of war, because it is not now only binary. It is not a zero-sum game. What we're looking at is an extremely complex equilibrium of multiple forces. It's not like musical chairs, or if it is, it's a special kind of musical chairs where every time the music stops, another player joins the game. I was talking to a Democratic congressman the other night, I'm ashamed to admit, and he was making some capital of the fact that the House has managed to intrude itself into the discussion about a possible arms control treaty by using its financial authority. And it occurred to me that we now have a situation in which at least 8 executive agencies, not all of them by any means united, confront 535 players on the Hill, and in many cases, individual staff members, as well as the individual members of the Senate and the Congress, have their own foreign policy and are taking a hand at that game. The result is, it seems to me, that the foreign policy game, as it is played in Washington, is increasingly neither a hierarchical structure in which orders travel down from the head of the executive to be carried out by his subordinates, nor a consultative game, but essentially a transactional one, where all the players go into this market and do business and try to increase their transferable political capital by the way the foreign policy game is carried out. Now, most foreign policy issues in the United States, most of the time, are closed politics issues. They are, if you like the iron triangles of political science theory. They are small matters which most people can afford to leave to those directly concerned, perhaps to a small group of congressmen and congressional staff, a handful of people in the executive branch, and those directly affected, whether they be American interest groups or whether they be the embassies of the countries concerned. The crucial dimension, it seems to me, or a crucial dimension to look at, is the process whereby these small, closed politics issues become major national issues which the whole of the Congress must take a stand upon and which demand attention at the White House. There are only a small number of issues at any one time that make that transition from the closed rock pool of closed politics to the stormy ocean of a national issue. The longest journey, you might say, is not from Brooklyn to Manhattan, but from the back burner to the front burner. The process, I think, the crucial agent in causing an issue to travel on that journey is the media. And I don't mean by the media necessarily the opinions of any particular part of the media. I mean the fact that this game has come to be played out in the forum of the media. As a result, I think we are in a situation where there are alternative temptations. One, the Bismarckian temptation. One, the neo-populist temptation. The trouble, it seems to me, with the Bismarckians, those who, metaphorically speaking, would like to clothe themselves in long, fur-collared overcoats and take cold, pragmatic decisions on the basis of power in secrecy. The problem that they have is that they are in danger of failing to carry public opinion with them, and there are notorious instances in recent history where that's happened. The opposite danger, of course, is that the populists are well able to generate the steam of public engagement and commitment, but they very often aim at the wrong target, or at least at a place where a moving target has ceased to be. Popular feeling, in fact, is a better cartridge than it is a foresight. The way I think, if I can be prescriptive for a moment, to tackle these things is not, in fact, to change the structure, but to try to persuade both the executive and the Congress to go back to the constitutional division of the foreign policy issue between them. It's quite clear that the executive was intended to act, the Congress was intended to scrutinize, and it seems to me that that is where the solution must lie. I'd like to just read you one interesting text, which I stumbled across when reading something else the other day, because it comes from an interesting source, I think. This is Mr. Sam Rayburn, one of those who took the highest view of the authorities and the powers of the Congress, and a Democrat, speaking, in fact not writing, speaking about where the balance between the executive and the Congress ought to lie. When the nation is in danger, said Mr. Rayburn, you have to follow your leader. The man in the White House is the only leader. If he doesn't or can't lead, then the nation has no leader. We may disagree with him, but we must follow our president in times of peril, regardless of which party he belongs to. I think I'd just close by suggesting that there is something that every successful president has felt instinctively, that it's not only the president's job to take the initiative in foreign policy, it's his duty to do so, if possible, in a way that carries Congress along with him and before the point where policy turns into action. And lastly, he ought to make sure that it's done in such a way that the president can cheerfully contemplate any congressional scrutiny. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hodgson. It's a pleasure to call upon Irving Kristol.
There are four forces that shape American foreign policy. I'll not mention the media as one of them because I don't think the media is one of them. When foreign policy succeeds, the media is impotent. When foreign policy fails, the media engages in its normal activity of crucifying people and subverting institutions to demonstrate its power over the world. That's the nature of the media. That's not going to change. But when you have a successfully executed foreign policy, even though the media may not have liked it, the media has nothing to say. The media didn't like Grenada. And afterwards came out with little stories about how bollocksed up the military invasion was, as if there had ever been a military invasion that wasn't an absolute chaotic mess. But the American people paid no attention. So I exclude the media from the making of foreign policy, and one of the problems I think we have in Washington is that people do not exclude the media when they think about foreign policy. They worry about what the Washington Post will say. They worry about what NBC will say, where the truth is, if you know what you're doing, if you can articulate what you're doing, and if you do it, and do it well, it doesn't matter what the media says. I don't know if that proves I'm right or that the media is not as popular as some people think. In any case, let's look at the four actors. One is the president, who is supposed to be essentially in charge of foreign policy. I mean, the founders understood that understood the advantage that tyrants would have over democracies when it came to foreign policy. They can move quickly. They do not have to cope with popular scruples. Today's enemy can become tomorrow's ally like that without any real explanation. They are far more agile, far more supple, can be far more ruthless. Those are all real advantages that dictatorships or tyrannies have over democracies, which is why the founders of this republic tried to create a strong presidency who would, in effect, shape and control foreign policy, with Congress simply kibitzing and, of course, blaming the president if things go wrong. That's, in a sense, the function of Congress, to be there in case things go wrong, and then hopefully to take the right action rather than the wrong one. But the second institution is Congress, which is obviously incompetent to cope with foreign policy. Tip O'Neill quite correctly said, all politics is local politics. That's a congressman. That's a congressional viewpoint. Congressmen do not see the world, they see their own restricted parochial interests. That's what they respond to. It isn't that they don't know enough, and here I'll get to Tullock in a moment. Some of them know an awful lot. It doesn't matter. Their perception is local. Their responsiveness is to local stimuli, and therefore Congress should, on the whole, let's say, be a backseat driver when it comes to foreign policy. As those of you who have had some experience of backseat drivers know that they can play a role. They can point out when you took the wrong turning. Again and again and again, they can point out when you took the wrong turning. And it's useful to have someone to tell you that you took the wrong turning, even though you know you took the wrong turning. That, as I see it, is the essential role of Congress, not to shape foreign policy, and certainly not to conduct foreign policy in the kind of detail with which Congress now exercises its sovereignty. Third force that shapes American foreign policy is the State Department. And here I come to Gordon Tullock, a former Foreign Service officer who has never recovered what I would regard as a normal vision of the world. Very hard for people in the Foreign Service ever to understand foreign policy. The reason is that they have been trained to be diplomats. State Department is not in the foreign policy business. The State Department is in the diplomacy business. And while those two are related, they are also, in a crucial respect, very, very different. Now, the first rule of foreign policy is know your friends and know your enemies. That's the first rule of foreign policy. Any State Department in a democracy has great difficulty following that rule, because any State Department, and most certainly ours, believes that the function of diplomacy is to keep friends friends and to make enemies into friends. And if only you left it to the experts in diplomacy, they probably could do it. It is very rare, I'm sure Gordon can come up with an instance or two from the historical record. It's very rare for a State Department in any democracy to say, diplomacy is hopeless here. We're going to have to go and beat the shit out of this guy. There may be such instances, but that's not the State Department's temper. Consequently, the State Department does diplomacy reasonably well. I have been impressed with the people I've met in the State Department. They are very well informed, very hardworking, sincerely committed to their job, and it's a job that has to be done. We need diplomacy. The problem is that we now have a huge State Department, thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people, and this gigantic bureaucracy is engaged in the diplomatic business, not in the foreign policy business, and is always looking for ways to give priority to diplomacy over foreign policy. I can go on that for hours, but perhaps in the question period, I'll return to it. The fourth actor, as it were, in foreign policy in a democracy, and most certainly in ours, since ours is such a non-deferential democracy, is the people. I was much amused by Gordon Tullock's story about attending this demonstration in London and not knowing all these people protesting something, well, I don't know, forget what it was, but Salonika, but not knowing where Salonika was. Well, I think they assumed that the Air Force knew where Salonika was, approximately. You don't have to know where Salonika is. I mean, you know, it doesn't matter what they know or what they don't know. They know what they know. Namely, they know that their world is full of people who may not like you. The world is full of some friends and some enemies. And you treat enemies as if they were enemies, and you treat friends as if they were friends. And then there's the large, neutral group, your second cousins, and depending on how they treat you, you treat them in return. I mean, that's, anyone who's been raised in a family, particularly if you have a fairly large family, has a basic intuitive understanding of foreign policy, uncolored and uncorrupted by training, by the kind of training one gets in the State Department or in schools of international affairs. Those simplicities are the strength of the American people or of any people when it comes to foreign policy. And they are very powerful simplicities when a president knows how to rely on them, when a president knows how to evoke them. And that is always the problem, in my view, of American foreign policy. The State Department is a permanent problem in American foreign policy. There's nothing, it's not going to be reformed. I mean, that's ridiculous. We need diplomats, after all. So you just leave them alone. You do what Henry Kissinger did. I mean, you let the department go on and you don't pay much attention to it. The key force in American foreign policy is when the president and the people together can make a decision as to what is to be done. And the way that happens is very simple. The president decides what has to be done. He goes to the people and says, this is what has to be done and why, and I'm doing it. If he doesn't do it, I mean, if he just says this is what has to be done and why and says, let's open a debate, forget it. There are a million arguments against doing anything in any situation in foreign policy. The debate can go on endlessly. The people rally behind action. Yeah, I am old enough to remember, everyone thinks of World War II as a popular war, and it became one. But I must tell you, American people had no desire whatsoever to get into World War II. And if the Japanese and the Germans had not been so foolish to attack us, thank God, we never would have got into World War II, in my opinion. Korean War, the initial response was, hey, the government says we must fight these guys. American initial response was yes, but then after a while, people couldn't understand why this war was going on so long and what our goals were exactly in the war. Apparently we were going to stop at something called the Yellow River. No one knew where the Yellow River was. I mean, it's like Salonika. But they understood that this was not the kind of war one gets into. Their instincts were absolutely right, as they were in Vietnam. American people supported the Vietnam until it became clear that the war was going nowhere, and that the people who were charged with the conduct of the war had some absolutely insane military strategy, brilliant and insane, a kind that only could have been invented by Harvard professors, as it was, namely the notion of gradual escalation. As if when you get into a fight with someone, he punches you in the nose, you punch him in the eye. You know, that's not the way fights are conducted. If you're in a bar and someone punches in the nose, you break a bottle over his head. Or you do something that will really deter. And no, if you send him to the hospital, that's the best possible deterrent. The notion of graduated response, which haunts us to this day in the Persian Gulf, I laughed and I cried when I heard Mr. Weinberger, a nice gentleman, and saw him explain why when the Iranians shot at a boat with an American flag, they weren't supposed to shoot at that boat. And what we do, we destroy 2 empty platforms out in the middle of the ocean somewhere. 2 empty platforms. We didn't want to kill any Iranians, God forbid. We want to conduct war without losing any of our soldiers, sometimes called boys and girls, and without hurting any of their soldiers, or civilians, God forbid. Similarly with the bombing of Iran, the whole thing was so ridiculous. If you're going to bomb, you bomb. You don't send over a few planes, drop a few bombs. As it happened, those few bombs seem to have had a considerable effect, but I really do believe that twice as many would have had a lot more effect. But in any case, presidential action in foreign policy is the key to a successful policy. My time is up, right? Now, mind you, one has to make allowances for circumstances. We have had, in my opinion, only 2 presidents in this century who have been successful in foreign policy. They were both Roosevelts, Theodore and Franklin. Franklin had a really tough what's it? Something to hoe. I'm an urban type. Whatever you do to hose. You row a hoe or you hoe a row, right? He had a country basically isolationist, and he wanted to get us into World War II on the side of Britain and the West. And he lied, he deceived, he was utterly Machiavellian as he maneuvered us into a position which invited Japan to attack us and provoked Hitler to attack us. Now, that is not a normal state of affairs. I don't like what he did, but I have to say he did it for a good reason, and I'm not sure it could have been done any other way. Theodore Roosevelt is a much better model from my point of view, and I think more relevant today, namely, Theodore Roosevelt never invaded anything. He really didn't have to. Woodrow Wilson invaded Mexico. Actually, that was popular too. Pointless though it may have been. But when you have a president who understands, and this is a crucial point which no one likes to mention, we have a country that is divided. All democracies are divided. We are divided by economics, we're divided by regions, we're divided by ethnicity, by religion, by race. An active foreign policy is the one thing that is capable of uniting the people, always. And therefore, it is very important, I think today, especially under present circumstances, that once again we get an active foreign policy now, or an activist foreign policy. Now, how we can persuade the Pentagon that their job is actually to fight sometimes, rather than to glower at the Russians. I have to finish this, I'm sorry. 10 years ago I gave a talk, and which I urged that the Defense Department change its name back to the War Department so that they would have some notion of what their mission was. But that has not got anywhere. And I don't like the term national security, which is an isolationist phrase. But in any case, one of these days, I hope we will get a president who understands the dynamics of American foreign policy, which are between the president and the people. And when those dynamics are right, the rest doesn't matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kristol. I'd like to tell you that we're a little bit short on time, so I will ask the panelists if any of them would like to raise a point of privilege or a quick rebuttal, and then we'll open it up to questions on the floor.
Yeah,
Professor Tullock.
Personal privilege. I was not well trained as a Department of State Foreign Service officer. In fact, when I left, the Department of State was every bit as happy as I was.
All right. Let's open it up to questions from the floor. The microphone in front.
My name is Peter Galantis. I'm an attorney in private practice in Chicago, representing the Chicago Lawyers Chapter of the Federalist Society. With respect to Mr. Kristol's point as to the primacy of action between the president and the people in the area of foreign affairs, I certainly have to agree that in military actions, such as the Libya bombing raid, for example, one acts and then takes the consequences in terms of public policy, public reaction to the policy. But in areas that involve more protracted conflicts in terms of the time involved, for example, the Nicaragua policy, for example, the debate about disarmament, the INF Treaty, the Space Shield, it seems to me that it's very difficult for the executive to act quickly and be done with it in terms of marshaling public support. I think that this is compounded by the fact that our negotiating adversaries in those areas have access to the American and Allied media, whereas we can't wage the war in the Soviet media. Is there some sort of an appropriate area in which the president can pursue your suggestion of acting first and then getting support as a consequence of the action, notwithstanding the protracted timeline on which these particular matters need to be worked out?
Yeah. Well, obviously, there is a whole area where the question of action is not military, but it can nevertheless be action. As regards the Soviet Union, I have always been very simple-minded. I think the American people are correctly simple-minded. To the degree that they behave nastily toward us, we should figure out ways to behave nastily toward them. We don't, unfortunately, have a department that figures out how to behave nastily to them. There's no such department in government. To the degree that they behave nicely toward us, we should behave nicely toward them. I mean, we live in a nuclear age. We don't want to go to the war with the Soviet Union. I assume they don't want to go to war with us. It's simply a matter of finding an appropriate response. An appropriate response usually is an over-response. That is, if they are nasty, we should be nasty plus. If they are nice, we should be nice. I think this is the way you deal with a country which, after all, is a self-declared enemy. It's not a friendly country. Nicaragua is a different case. There, we could have had action and should have had action. That was simply a mistake going back many years. We simply should have told the Nicaraguans. I was discussing this with Godfrey Hodgson earlier. You know, you want to have socialism in that one country, that miserable little country, okay. That's your affair. You want to even have communism in that miserable little country, we probably will let you alone. But no Soviet military assistance, no Soviet or East European or Cuban technicians, no Soviet bases, of course, no Soviet alliance. Isolate yourself from the Soviet Union. I'll use the term Finlandize yourself vis-a-vis us, and we won't intervene. But if you insist on being a client state of the Soviet Union, we will intervene militarily, which is what we should have done instead of establishing the countries and finding ourselves in this very complex, long, drawn-out situation. The president could have done it on his own. It would have taken maybe 2 weeks, maybe one. Now it probably would be more difficult. But there was a strong case for giving the Nicaraguan government an ultimatum, followed, if necessary, by military action. But then there are, you know, other instances of cases of neither war nor peace. And, you know, it doesn't really matter so much so long as people understand other nations understand if they behave well toward you, we'll behave well toward them. If not, not. And as I say, the problem is easy if they behave well toward you. Then that's trouble. We have problems when they behave nastily toward us, like voting the wrong way at the United Nations. Poor Jean Kirkpatrick and her staff went through hell and unsuccessfully trying to persuade the State Department to tell these countries, you vote against us on an issue that we think to be important, and we will insist that you pay a price on some other issue. And the State Department adamantly refuses to accept that conception of its role. So I turn once again to the simplicities, which I think can be very helpful in guiding us in most of these areas.
Irving, I'd like to make a short comment and something of a dissent on your interpretation of what the simplicities of what public opinion are and how they look at the world. You say that in the pre-war era, the American public was isolationist, which was FDR's problem. And I would argue that after a short period, an aberrational period, I would argue, which lasted between the end of the Second World War and Vietnam, there was a sort of a national consensus on our role in the world, but that has shattered, and we have reverted to, I think, that pre-war position. And although I would agree with you that the American public will support three-day wars, that is a hell of a restriction on the freedom of action of the executive if the only things it can accomplish in the world are wars that can be over in a week or won in 3 days, as Grenada is. I'll grant you that if you invade and you win in a week, American public opinion will rally. But I would argue that there is a huge area of foreign affairs and a large number of enemies who cannot be approached in that way. And that's where our difficulty is with public opinion. They may not like these people, but I think the burdens of opposing them are such that they would rather spend less, risk less, and withdraw if necessary than act decisively. Questioner in the back, please.
In discussing the drawbacks of democracy and the conduct of foreign affairs, Congress has really received quite the lion's share of the blame today. But there's also a growing tendency among governors and mayors to interfere in foreign politics. What can be done about nipping this trend in the bud?
Nipping this trend in the bud. Any takers on that?
Well, I would just say that this is part of that well-thrashed subject, the decline of party. And then what you have is, as I say, a transactional world in which anybody who is running for office who sees any advantage for himself in picking up any foreign policy issue will do so, whether he be a mayor or a governor or a congressman or whatever he be.
A question in the front.
Yeah, Mr. Krauthammer, you mentioned national ethos, and clearly in a democracy where we have differences of opinion, consensus is not something that comes easily. Yet we see at this time, I guess for any foreign policy to be successful, it does need to be foundedly based in values that the public in general would agree to. The popularity of Professor Alan Bloom's book, Closing the American Mind, shows that a lot of people are interested in these questions of values right now. How should we take advantage of that interest?
Well, it seems to me that the problem of the reluctance of American people to shoulder the burdens of a superpower are not so much a question of values. I think the values are there. They want to promote democracy, that they don't like tyranny. But it's a question of seeing what means are worth being employed, what risks are worth being taken to promote them. And I think the overriding factor in public opinion in looking at risks that we ought to take in the world is the undeniable fact that the American homeland is extremely safe relative to almost any nation on earth. Our history is one of non-invasion. We have an enormous excess of nuclear power. it's hard for Americans to see the need to act. A few days ago, I saw a debate on the tube with a Democratic congressman arguing about our Nicaragua policy and stating that, after all, why are we so obsessed with the Sandinistas? This is a country of 3 million people. What possible threat can they pose to the United States? The argument is almost none. But by that logic, we should not have any troops in Korea or practically anywhere else, because the North Koreans are less likely to get into their Toyotas and head for Arlington, Texas, than the Sandinistas are. I mean, it's not as if the real issue is which of these small countries is a threat to the physical safety of the United States. It seems to me that when that is the perspective, then it seems to me an isolationist foreign policy has to follow. When the perspective is one of a superpower, of looking after interests and allies and values, then you have a larger perception of our role in the world. And then the way that you approach a question like Nicaragua or Korea is different, and I would argue more salutary.
Yeah, that is one of the reasons I don't like the term national security, because it leads to the implication that if the North Koreans or the Nicaraguans are not about to attack the United States, they do not pose a national security problem for us, or a foreign affairs problem. And by the way, I don't know, I'm not a scholar in this field, I'm curious to know. I don't know where that term came from and how it achieved such prominence. My impression is that in the earlier decades of this country, the term national security was not common coin in discussions of foreign policy.
That's 1947, right.
1947.
It became part of the official lexicon at that point. Questioner in the back.
Yeah, Professor Tullock, could you elaborate on the distinction between international and domestic affairs from a public choice perspective that would make it harder to come up with solutions for the former than for the latter?
Since I've written some 12 books on the subject, and there isn't much repetition in them, that's a difficult question to answer briefly. But there are a variety of things. The first place, within the country, if you have, as we do, a great deal of local variety, you can live in one state or another, there is a way of voting which is called voting with your feet. And you can move from one place to another, and people do. And you have, if you look in the area right around large cities, you'll find a whole collection of little cities, each of which offers a sort of a merchandisable package of taxes and government services. And they really aren't controlled by votes. It's essentially the real estate lobby that runs the thing, and they aim for maximizing the value of the real estate by attracting people in. It's something like a business. A man who doesn't like this theory referred to it as a Holiday Inn theory of politics. And there is much to be said for it. That's the first item. The second thing is that a great many of the issues that government deals with have the lovely combination that the number of people who are being injured by them and the number of people who are being benefited by them are about the same. Unfortunately, that's only a great number. The ones where that is not true, it works badly, although I think things can be done to improve it. I would say those are the two major problems. There is another one, which is that to some extent the economic matters are a little clearer. I emphasize a little clearer. Anybody who reads public discussions on tariffs, for example, quickly realizes they aren't very clear.
Questioner in the front.
First, to start, I would like to thank you, Mr. Kristol. I am soon graduating from the university and was once considering the State Department as employment, so you've certainly cleared that up.
We need you there.
There's the first example of a soul being saved at this gathering. You could be a presidential candidate.
The first question is directed to Mr. Tullock. I'm a little bit confused about your statement concerning successful foreign policy. I believe, unless I was mistaken here, you described the United States as not being very popular or successful in our foreign policy, and you named several of our failures. You blamed most of this on bad management, and as I understand that is due because of the bad or because of the goals of our president and Congress, that being immediately to get reelected. I would like to know which countries, in your mind, are popular in their foreign policy and affairs, and what is the goal of their leaders and their governors? And the second question, which I'd like to ask, which is think a little bit quicker, is to Mr. Kristol. You mentioned Nicaragua in one of your answers, and my family's from Nicaragua. My family was ousted in 1979, and so I'm adamantly very anti-communist. I'm just very concerned or curious about when you think the United States should have taken action, whether it should have been previous to 1979 or exactly at what time.
If I could insist on short answers because of the line. Professor Tullock?
The only country that I know that really is wildly popular are places like Cuba, etc. Cuba, Russia to some extent, China, but they're only popular among the intellectuals. It's an interesting fact that most of the small countries that are sort of under Russian dominance, like Libya, Algeria, Yemen, all have rules under which only a very limited number of Russian naval vessels can fill out their harbors simultaneously, because the government may be pro-Russian, but it doesn't trust them. And in Cuba, there's this one brigade of Russian troops, just about enough to protect Castro, but not enough really to safely overthrow him. If the Russians wanted to put in 2 brigades, I think the Cubans would object. But actually, if you look at the average press, we are among the most unpopular countries in the world. And
the citizens of their own country, then. I think I misunderstood that.
I'm sorry, what?
You meant popularity by within that country?
No, heavens no. We are probably more popular in the Soviet Union than the Soviet Union is. I mean popularity elsewhere, let's say in France. I should say France is not a good example, because just the moment there's being something of a reversion. But when I visit Europe, I always find a lot of people who are concerned about American foreign policy and the terrible things we are doing, and think that one of the terrible things we are doing is not trusting the Russians. I don't know, maybe you don't have this compact. I do all the time. I usually respond to that by saying that I think the United States should get out of Europe and run the experiment, find out if the Russians can be trusted.
Mr. Kristol, the question was, at what point would you have acted in Nicaragua?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I don't know that I can give a date. At the point where the President of the United States became convinced that the Sandinistas intended to set up a client state for the Soviet Union. Now, the President at the time was Jimmy Carter, so I don't know when he became convinced of it, if he ever did. But in any case, we really did have time until, I would guess, 81, easily, before we had made a full commitment to the Contras. Now it's very difficult to come forward with that kind of ultimatum and that kind of threat. But we may end up doing so nevertheless. Let me elaborate on one point that Charles made, about, I think, in a way, Grenada, though a useful incident, has been misleading. Now people are go around saying, well, sure, the American people will support a deployment of troops overseas or invasion of a foreign country if it lasts 2 or 3 days or maybe a week. American people supported the Vietnam for about 3 years before public opinion began to shift against it. And that involved hundreds of thousands of troops and large numbers of casualties. The American people are not silly on these matters. If it's a difficult job, they expect it to take longer. But they do expect to see a point to it all. They do expect to see a successful conclusion to it all. I think Gordon Tullock was absolutely right when he says we lost the Korean War, as we obviously lost the Vietnam War. Given our preponderance and strength vis-a-vis North Korea or even vis-a-vis China. At that time, to fight to a draw, that was a defeat. And the world understood that. And the American people did not like it and repudiated the war so that Eisenhower could win the election on the basis of ending the war.
Question in the back.
Yes, my name is Nick Gutierrez, and I'm the president of the Federalist Society chapter at Georgetown. We very much enjoyed your lively and enlightening debate here this afternoon, and I was hoping that maybe Mr. Krauthammer and or Mr. Kristol, along the lines of yesterday where several of our distinguished panelists talked about whether the INF agreement in Europe was in the national interest of the United States. Can we have some comments on the propriety and maybe the efficacy of the Baker-Wright plan in Central America and the ensuing Arias plan with its seemingly elastic deadline for the Sandinistas? Is this really a realistic way in which we can see democracy come to Nicaragua, or is it really a ruse for the installation of another totalitarian regime in our hemisphere?
Go.
Irving?
Go.
God, it's late, so I'll be very short. It seems to me that something very interesting has happened with this plan. It obviously is intended by the Sandinistas to be a ruse or a device to disarm the Contras and to consolidate their power. That seems to me to be overwhelmingly obvious. Whether it can be turned into something other than that is a question. I would have said a month ago it can't. I still would say that the odds are very long against it producing a good outcome. But what's interesting is that that it has turned from being a plan into really a man. It seems to me the real key player here now is Arias. In an interesting way, it's not just his Nobel Prize. He's become the arbiter of what the plan means. He's the Supreme Court adjudicating its provisions. There's nothing about direct negotiations, but when he insisted on it, it became an issue. It became an issue not because he has as Stalin would have said, a lot of divisions, but because the Democrats in Congress cannot be to the left of Arias, so that he patrols the perimeter of political debate in the U.S. And I think if he is able to keep the pressure on by making demands that will force the Sandinistas either into making concessions which threaten their ultimate hold on power, or rejecting Arias's demands in a way that is so obvious that even Democrats on the Hill will understand what's happening, I think there could be out of this plan some movement in a positive direction, either a resumption of aid to the Contras or perhaps some miscalculation on the part of the Sandinistas in the direction of a very large opening through which Democrats could enter the political process.
Thank you.
Questioner in the front.
My question is really directed to Mr. Krauthammer and Mr. Kristol, and it reflects the following sort of discomfort. Why did I come here, and why am I troubled about constitutionalism, American foreign policy? And in part, it's because I think things are going wrong. And they're not going wrong because the American people are isolationists, and certainly not because they're nationalists, and both are true. And they're not going wrong, I would think, because the presidency is weak, because when we had a Carter presidency and Pat Darien was destabilizing Iran and Nicaragua and Ethiopia, an activist presidency is certainly something to be avoided. So it's the substantive part of the policy, to wit, that somehow America's power is not being exercised appropriately against the Soviet Union's effort to replace it as a major power. And the feeling there, and perhaps if we're doing it in these formal terms, is what might be omitted, this is the hypothesis and the question, is the sense in which there is an establishment. When you spoke about consensus, from 1947 or 48 or 49, the American establishment, whether it's the media, the universities, people from whom one recruited the CIA, which Mr. Webster spoke about, people like that, agreed on a certain consensus on policy. That establishment split, Foreign Policy magazine and so on, in the mid-60s, and since then we have had an adversary culture on foreign policy where the media, despite Mr. Kristol's correct comments about them, where the media, where the left wing of the Democratic Party are setting the agenda or blocking the agenda in foreign policy, so we have not been able to reestablish an effective foreign policy. Now, if that's the case, the issue is not presidency, Congress, or even isolationism, nationalism. The issue is the breakdown of a functional American elite group or establishment group in the face of the adversary elite culture. And that's the hypothesis I would like to have your reaction to.
Would you comment?
Well, you know, David, you're absolutely right. I should introduce David Sadowski as professor of philosophy at Columbia. We don't have an establishment. The Council of Foreign Relations once was the establishment together with Wall Street and a few universities. It broke down because, well, for various reasons, but one of the reasons it broke down was because the vision on which this establishment was founded, namely what I would call liberal internationalism, has founded. This establishment grew out of World War I. It was anti-isolationist, pro-Western Europe, involved in vindicating and trying to establish a viable League of Nations. It was pro-war in the 1930s, pro-interventionist, as we would now say. It then became pro-League of Nations in the 1940s and the early 50s. And it is the establishment that ran the Korean Wars and the Vietnam Wars. And that delegitimized that establishment. There were other forces at work, national forces. I mean, the Northeast is not what it used to be in terms of its influence on Washington. California, for better or worse, has become considerably more important. But we don't have an establishment, and I don't see how we're going to get one. The universities have withdrawn from public life, largely. I mean, given what's happening in the universities, I think that's a blessing. You know, that in effect, our universities have become adversary ghettos, at least as far as the faculty is concerned, not so far as the students are concerned. And we'll just have to cope without an establishment. And it's always easy to get things done if you have an establishment with its powers of persuasion and even its powers of intimidation to get them done.
But Irving, just a follow-up, if I may. But
I can't
your
hear you,
own
David.
question, just a little follow-up, but your own answer skirts the strength of the adversary establishment, or adversary culture. It's not an establishment, adversary counter, and its role in policy.
Well, the adversary culture is a large, complex phenomenon. When it comes to foreign policy, it's simply a left-wing culture. I think that describes it fairly. It's not, you know, it's not involved in deconstructionism in foreign policy. It's not involved in any of these arcane neo-Marxist or anti-bourgeois conceptual elaborate theories. It's simply left-wing, that's all. And essentially, it's not even pro-communist most of the time. It's just anti-American. And we do have a large class of scholars and intellectuals who will deny they're anti-American because they are for an America that they can imagine, but are against the America that in fact exists. They are for an ideal America. They are against, they dislike, don't like existing America. But that I regard as being anti-American.
Question in the back.
I'm Mark Seidenberg. I'm with State Department Watch. My question deals with the activities of areas dealing with state rights in the making of foreign policy. I have a letter here that was written on October 13th from the Attorney General of Alaska notifying the Department of State. I'm just going to read one sentence and I'll go into the question. It says, states have an essential and overriding interest in negotiations of United States international boundaries when the negotiations may have an effect on alternating state boundaries. Now, the issue is 5 Alaskan islands have been up for grabs since 1981, and they've had 7 rounds of negotiations from the State Department without the consent of the state of Alaska. Now, when Daniel Webster was negotiating the Webster-Asperton Treaty in 1842, the states of Massachusetts and Maine were invited to send commissioners, and then the Webster ruled that they had to have the consent of those states in order to change boundaries. Yet now, a little over 100 years later, the State Department is trying to give away these 5 Alaska Islands without the consent or participation of the state of Alaska. And my question basically is, I've been hearing the discussions all along, what ways could the states assert their proper rights in foreign policies that they used to have in the treaty-making process, i.e. in relationship boundary negotiations affecting those states?
Question in the front.
I invite the panel to consider for a moment, if it cares to, whether the United States might not improve its performance in foreign affairs as a democracy by striving, and by that I mean by striving on the part of the educated class, to emulate the French in at least two particulars. One would be to preserve a democratic educational system, but which is not afraid of the elitist label. In France, if you have the brains, you can get the education, whether you have the money or not. But if you don't have the brains and perform and get the baccalaureate, you cannot. And secondly, the French people identify with their country in a way which the Americans do not, in every aspect of their daily life. And the result is that a nation of 40 or 60 million people is brilliantly running away with foreign affairs, whereas we are not. France was mentioned at the outset of the discussion. I offer it in these respects as a model to be favorably considered.
Okay, yes, Professor Tullock.
About the education business. The people who have high IQs are going to have high life incomes, whether we subsidize their education or not. Taxing the people with low IQs for the purpose of giving people who are going to have high life incomes an even higher life income seems to me an extremely unfair thing to do. Now, I realize that practically everybody here, and I went to a private university myself, University of Chicago, but I'm now working for a government institution. Practically everybody here, one way or another, has benefited from this system. But really, there's very little that can be said in favor of taxing the average working slob to make certain that high IQ people have even higher incomes than they otherwise would.
We'll take.
Was there another part of that question? Something about education?
We'll take two more questions, one in the back, one in the front. Start with the one in the back, please.
Mr. Kristol, we studied 1987 in my grade. I'm in grade 11 at Newark Academy in New Jersey. I am 16 years of age, and the foreign policy situation in America concerns me greatly. I think I have more to lose or to gain, as the case might be, than anybody else in this room, because I'm going to be around a lot longer, I hope, than anybody else.
You never know.
If I don't smoke. I would like the panelists to convey to me what is their feeling about the current arms deals that we're trying to work out with the Soviet Union. I myself happen to believe that the strongest defense is a strong offense. I'm not too happy about the reduction of arms, and people argue with me about that. I'd like to hear your opinions on that.
We have 3 minutes left, so I'll ask for a 1 minute reply.
First of all, I want to tell you, with all due respect, I think it's unhealthy for a 16-year-old to be terribly interested in American foreign policy. There are
Senator
other things he should be more interested in. Secondly, I am one of those conservatives who happen to support the INF agreement. The Soviets put in those intermediate-range missiles in order to intimidate Western Europe. Western Europe finally got around to matching that with putting in its own intermediate-range missiles. The Soviets said, oops, we made a mistake. Let's withdraw the missiles. I think it's a fair deal. I have no problem with it.
Yes, last question.
Mr. Kristol, I believe, if I understood you rightly, that you say that if we have an active policy by the president, that the country will follow.
Well, it depends on the president, I suppose. I mean, if I were president, the country would follow, right?
All right. Well, now, when 7 of the 8 principal opinion-making members of the media are liberal, and you are a conservative president, and the 3 networks, Time, Newsweek, Post, New York Times, and all come out with a liberal viewpoint of whatever you do. And the Wall Street Journal, which is half liberal, and your articles come out twice a week, or twice a month, or whatever, and are great, thank you. How can you generate public opinion behind a conservative policy when you're half licked before you start?
How did Ronald Reagan get elected president twice? You know, you do it.
Well, you think that it goes away overnight? This happens overnight?
No, the
it takes
media
a
are
tremendous...
very influential, but they do not shape American politics. Political activists shape American politics.
Do you think that there is enough momentum in the conservative movement today to carry over the tremendous liberal advantage that they seem to have over these last few months?
Well, we had the momentum, seem to have lost quite a lot of it. We may have to recharge our batteries in the immediate future, and that's the way politics is. What do you say?
How would you lead it?
I'm not going to lead it. Sorry, I have other things to do.
Well, with that declaration of non-candidacy, which we can add Mr. Kristol's name to a long and distinguished list of people who are not running, I want to thank our panel and thank you all for your attention.